What would you do if men in masks kidnapped your family and forced you to help them steal millions? This isn't a Hollywood movie. This happened in the UK in February 2006. And what followed was the biggest cash robbery in the history of the UK. 53 million pounds were stolen in one night, and the story behind it is chilling. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to a new episode of Fast with a Punchline. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the biggest cash robbery in the history of Britain and how 53 million pounds disappeared in a night. Securitas was a high security cash depot. Inside, banknotes meant for ATMs, payrolls, and banks across southern England. On any given night, 10 millions of pounds sat in their vaults. The depot manager was Colin Dixon, an ordinary family man, but to the gang, he was the key. For months, the robbers had been watching him, studying his routines, his home, his car, and even his family. They weren't just planning a robbery, they were planning a kidnapping. The thieves weren't just random thugs. This was a carefully chosen team. At the top was Lee Lightning Murray, a cage fighter from South London. Loud, confident, and ruthless. He treated the robbery like a match, and he was the organizer. But a plan this bold needed someone from the inside. And that insider was Emir Haysinash. He was hired through a recruitment agency, and he worked quietly in the depot. But hidden on his belt was a tiny camera. He filmed the corridors, the routines, and the vaults, handling priceless intel back to the gang. Murray's trusted associate, Leia Rusha, helped keep the crew together. He was a roofer, an MMA fighter, and a nightclub bouncer, used to violence and intimidation. His main job? Control. Keep the man disciplined and keep the hostages quiet. Then there was Jetmir Buchpapa, a childhood friend of Haysinash. He handled much of the surveillance and logistics, testing hidden cameras, scouting routes, and running errands for the gang. Together, they drilled and planned, meeting at houses, burner phones, recon run in borrowed cars, and stopwatches timed to the second. They even practiced with pallet movers because they knew the cages of cash would be too heavy to be carried by hand. It was rehearsed like a military operation, but with one small difference. These weren't soldiers, they were criminals. In the days before the raid, the gang's movements were anything but random. They rented cars under false names, they drove around Town Bridge again and again, memorizing routes and escape points. They even scouted Dixon's house in daylight, noting the fences, the driveways, even how close the neighbors lived. They also stole some police uniforms. All the tools were gathered, and every detail was rehearsed. By the time the night came, they weren't improvising. They were executing a plan, one that had been drilled to perfection. On February 21st, 2006, it began. Colin Dixon was driving home when he saw flashing blue lights. A police car. He pulled over, but the officers weren't police. They were gang members in fake uniforms and carrying weapons. Dixon was handcuffed and told his family would die if he did not cooperate. At the same time, another team was at his house, and his wife and young son were taken as hostages. And Dixon now wasn't just a depot manager, he was leverage. And the gang made sure that he understood, do exactly as we say, or your family dies. That night, Dixon was driven back to the depot, and the gang followed in a lorry. Inside, his terrified staff were working the night shift. When Dixon walked in, flanked by masked gunmen, the employees froze. The robbers rounded up everyone, around 14 staff members, hands tied, locked in cages, and threatened to be quiet. The vault was eventually opened, and cash stacked to the ceiling, tens of millions of banknotes. The gang worked fast, loading sack after sack in the lorry. 53 million pounds taken in just 1 hour. To put that in perspective, that's over a ton of banknotes. There was so much cash that they couldn't even take it all. Millions were left behind. And then they vanished into the night. When police arrived, the staff were shaking but alive, and no one had been killed that night. but the robbers had just pulled off the biggest cash robbery in the history of Britain. The investigation began immediately, checking CCTV footages, abandoned vehicles, and fingerprints. Slowly, the picture came together, and the mastermind was revealed, Lee Morey. And despite executing the perfect crime, greed always leaves a trail. And one by one, arrests were made, but it wasn't instant. The investigation was a classic mix of police work and little mistakes made by the criminals. The detectives ran every possible lead: CCTV from the depot, phone records, rental agreements, and vehicle hire logs, a white van abandoned near the depot, and a hired lorry traced back later to the hiring firm. Alongside surveillance footages gave detectives threads to pull. Forensic also managed to seize uniforms and tools from the safe house, and phone records showed a pattern that linked the suspects together. What followed was a series of raids led by the police. At one farm, they found hundreds of thousands of pounds hidden under a tree and in car boots. At another address, officers discovered footage of Dixon's home and radio scanner tuned to emergency frequencies. Combined with the hidden camera footages and the phone logs, hardened the case against the gang. Arrests came in waves across London, Kent, and the UK. Amir Haisinaj, the depot insider, was one of the first detained. Leah Rusha, Anjetmir Buchpapa, and several others were arrested soon after. Some suspects were even caught with cash, while others were tied to the crime scene by phone records and forensics. However, the mastermind led overseas. Lee Lightning Morey fled the UK and he was arrested in Morocco. Luckily for him, extradition failed because Morocco refused, since Morey also held citizenship. So he was trialed and jailed there and was sentenced to 25 years. In Britain, the others faced trial. Haisinaj, Rusha, and Bushpapa and more were convicted and receiving long sentences. But there's the twist. Most of the £53 million were never recovered. Police seized millions hidden in farms, but tens of millions remain missing till today. The Securitas depot robbery shocked the nation. It wasn't just money, it was the cruelty, the kidnapping of a wife and a child, and the abduction of 14 staff members. It showed that no matter how secure the system is, human weaknesses can still break it. Was it the perfect crime? No, because the gang underestimated one important thing. The house doesn't just win in casinos, it wins in real life too. And yet, somewhere in the shadows, millions of pounds remain missing. This is the end of today's story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any more ideas for me to cover in the next episodes, leave it in the comments. Until next time.
InAudio.